The rain had been falling since morning, long silver threads sliding down the kitchen window, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of gray and green. Elaine stood by the counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. The house was too quiet. It always was after the wedding. Mark had come by earlier than expected. He said he wanted to fix the gutter before the storm got worse. That was 3 hours ago. She hadn't expected him to stay this long. From the porch came the low creak of the ladder, then his voice, warm, patient, with that quiet steadiness that once drew her daughter to him. Elaine turned her gaze toward the window again, and there he was. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, rain dripping from his jawline. His shirt clinging to his shoulders as he worked. For a moment, something unfamiliar twisted in her chest. Not desire, not yet, but something neighboring it. She quickly looked away. When the door opened, a gust of wind swept in with him. He laughed softly, shaking off the rain. "I think the roof's safe for now," he said, his tone easy, unaware of the small tremor in her breath. "You didn't have to do that," she replied. "You'll catch a cold." He smiled. "You always say that." Elaine felt her lips curve despite herself. "Because it's true." He set down his tools, brushed water from his hair, and looked around the kitchen. It was the same kitchen he and Sarah had painted together before the wedding, the one filled with late-night laughter and spilled wine. But Sarah was gone now. Not forever, just away. A conference in Chicago, a new position, her first big chance. It was supposed to be just a week. And yet, somehow, those days had begun to stretch, as though time itself had slowed to watch something it shouldn't. They sat at the table. Elaine poured him tea. He accepted it with a nod, his fingers brushing hers, briefly, almost accidentally, but enough to pull a small current through her. She tried to ignore it. "How's Sarah?" she asked, careful to sound casual. "Busy," he said. "I barely hear from her lately. She's doing well, though. You know how she is. All fire, all focus." Elaine nodded. She did know. Sarah had always burned bright, restless, ambitious, impossible to catch. Sometimes, Elaine wondered if her daughter had inherited too much of her father's distance and too little of her own steadiness. "She'll be fine," Elaine said softly. Mark's gaze lingered on her a moment too long before he looked away. "Yeah," he murmured. "She always is." Silence stretched between them. The kind of silence that carries something unspoken. Rain tapped the windows, steady and slow. Elaine rose to refill his cup, anything to keep her hands busy. But when she turned, he was watching her. Not with the polite fondness of a son-in-law, but with something searching, uncertain, and deeper than it should have been. Her throat tightened. "What is it?" she asked, half smiling. He shook his head, almost embarrassed. "You remind me of her sometimes. The way you move. The way you look when you're trying not to say what you're thinking." That last line hung in the air. Elaine froze, the teapot trembling slightly in her hand. She managed a soft laugh. "That's quite a dangerous observation, Mark." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't mean it that way." "I know." But they both knew he might have. That evening, when the storm deepened, the lights flickered and went out. Elaine lit candles, their soft glow painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. Mark found a blanket, draped it over her shoulders without a word. "Thank you," she whispered. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. They listened to the rain drum on the roof, to the trees bending in the wind. She wanted to speak, to say something ordinary, safe, but the quiet between them had grown thick, intimate, fragile. Every word now felt like it might break something sacred or awaken something sleeping. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. She turned to him. "Miss what?" "Being in love." Elaine inhaled slowly. "At my age?" she teased, though her voice wavered. He didn't laugh. "At any age." She looked away. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I think it changes. Becomes quieter. Less about fire, more about warmth that stays." He nodded. "I think I'd like that kind of love. Their eyes met, and for a breathless instant, the room seemed to shrink. The storm outside, the years between them, the unspoken boundaries, all fading into the soft flicker of candlelight. Then Elaine stood abruptly. "You should stay in the guest room tonight," she said, her tone too quick. "The roads are flooded." He hesitated, searching her face, then nodded. "All right." When he left the room, Elaine let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her pulse was too fast. Her hands, trembling slightly, gripped the edge of the table. This was madness. He was her daughter's husband. And yet, as she stood there in the dim light, listening to the echo of his footsteps upstairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had begun, something neither of them had meant to start. That night Elaine lay awake. Rain whispered against the windows, a sound both tender and relentless. Down the hall, she could hear the faint creak of floorboards as Mark moved, restless, unable to sleep. She closed her eyes, trying to will the thoughts away. But her mind betrayed her, showing flashes of his smile, the way he'd looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he said her name. It had been so long since someone had looked at her like that. She turned on her side, pressing her face into the pillow, trying to drown out the ache that had settled somewhere between longing and guilt. Somewhere deep inside, beneath years of restraint and reason, a part of her had awakened, fragile, foolish, and impossibly alive. And though she didn't yet know it, the week ahead would test them both, in ways neither could have imagined. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a silence so sharp it felt almost deliberate. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. The sky, pale and uncertain, stretched wide above the soaked fields. Elaine stood on the porch with her robe wrapped tightly around her, watching the mist lift from the grass. She hadn't slept. Every hour of the night had been long, restless, haunted by fragments of thoughts she couldn't untangle. Behind her, she heard the creak of the floorboards. His step, unmistakable now. "Morning," Mark said quietly. His voice was rough with sleep. She didn't turn. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep." He stepped beside her, close enough that she could sense his warmth, though he kept a careful distance. The sky was beginning to blush faintly with dawn, a soft pink blooming along the horizon. "I was thinking," he began, his tone hesitant, "maybe I should go back today. Sarah might call." Elaine nodded, still looking at the horizon. "That's probably best." But neither of them moved. Inside over coffee, they tried to act like the night before hadn't stretched taut between them like a thread ready to break. Mark spoke about work, the endless meetings, the clients he didn't care for. Elaine listened, nodding, pretending to be simply a kind listener, the way a mother-in-law should be. Yet every time he smiled, something inside her faltered. At one point, when he reached for the sugar bowl, his hand brushed hers again. Just a touch, light, accidental, but it lingered too long to be meaningless. He froze, eyes lifting to hers. It was only a heartbeat, but it changed the air in the room. She withdrew her hand, gently, deliberately, and tried to smile. "You should finish your coffee before it gets cold," she said. He looked down, nodding, though neither of them cared about the coffee anymore. By noon, the sun had burned through the clouds. The world outside looked clean again, renewed. But inside the house, everything felt altered. Elaine decided to busy herself with the garden, pulling on gloves and stepping out into the damp soil. The air was crisp, full of the smell of earth and leaves. She hoped the simple rhythm of tending plants would quiet her thoughts. Mark joined her after a while, saying he wanted to help before leaving. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to." He crouched beside her, handing her tools, brushing soil from the stems of the roses she'd planted last spring. They worked in silence for a while, their movements synchronized in that strange, unconscious way that comes when two people are trying not to think about each other. At one point, she leaned over to reach a branch, and he instinctively steadied her by the arm. It was nothing, a reflex, but when she looked up at him, his hand remained there a moment too long. Their eyes met. The air between them thickened. "Elaine," he murmured, her name slipping out almost like a confession. She felt her breath catch. The sound of her name from his lips felt dangerous, intimate in a way it shouldn't be. "You should go," she said softly, but her voice trembled. "Before this turns into something neither of us can take back." He hesitated, then nodded, but not immediately. He looked at her one last time, and something unspoken passed between them. Then he turned, walked toward the car, and was gone. Elaine stood there long after the sound of the engine faded. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt hollow. The week that followed was strange. Sarah called once, cheerful, distracted, her voice bright with a kind of excitement that used to belong to youth and ambition. Elaine smiled and said all the right things, but when she hung up, the house felt emptier than before. Mark didn't call. He didn't text. Not that he should have. But still, she caught herself glancing at her phone more than once. Each evening, she replayed small fragments in her mind. The touch of his hand, the warmth of his presence, the quiet in his eyes that mirrored her own loneliness. By the third night, she told herself it was madness, just the echo of solitude, the illusion of closeness born from circumstance. But she didn't quite believe it. On Friday he returned. It was late afternoon, the sun already lowering, when she saw his car pull into the drive. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it. He stepped out, holding a small box in his hands. "Forgot my tools," he said simply. Her pulse stumbled. "You could have called." "I know," he replied. "But I wasn't sure I should." They stood there on the porch again, the same place where everything had begun to shift. The air was heavy with things unsaid. She gestured toward the door. "Come in, then." Inside, the light was soft and golden. Dust floated lazily through the air, catching the sunset. He set the box down but didn't leave right away. "You've been all right?" he asked. "Yes," she lied. "You look tired." "So do you." He smiled faintly. "Maybe we both are." There was a long pause. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I keep thinking about that night." Elaine's heart clenched. "Don't." "I try not to," he said. "But it won't leave me." She turned away, staring at the faint reflection of light on the glass cabinet. "You love Sarah," she said. "I do." "Then this can't exist." "I know," he said again, softer this time. "But it does." She closed her eyes. The truth in his voice was unbearable. It wasn't desire that frightened her most. It was recognition. The way he seemed to see her, not as Sarah's mother, not as someone from another generation, but as a woman. A woman who had once loved and lost and learned to hide her longing behind routine and politeness. And for the first time in years, someone saw that part of her again. When he finally left that evening, the sun had already set. Elaine stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the road, swallowed by twilight. Something in her chest ached, not for what had happened, but for what couldn't. She went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat at the table in silence. The house was full of ghosts, laughter, footsteps, years of memory, but it had never felt quite like this before. She didn't know if Mark would come back again. But deep down, she knew that even if he didn't, something in her had already changed. The boundary between what was right and what was real had begun to blur, and there was no unseeing what they had both silently confessed. Sarah's return filled the house with motion again. Footsteps, laughter, the rustle of luggage, the quick hum of her voice as she recounted stories from Chicago. Elaine smiled, listened, nodded in all the right places. But inside, she felt something fragile bracing itself, a quiet dread that trembled behind every word. Mark arrived late that evening, bringing flowers and that easy charm he wore like armor. He kissed Sarah softly, the way a husband should, and for a brief, painful moment, Elaine saw how right they looked together. And yet, when his eyes met hers across the room, just for a second, something wordless passed between them, unmistakable and dangerous. It was enough to steal her breath. Dinner was loud, bright, full of the kind of noise that should have drowned everything else out. But to Elaine, it only seemed to amplify what couldn't be said. Sarah talked about her new position, about how her boss had hinted at a permanent promotion. Mark listened, proud and attentive, though Elaine noticed the way his hand tightened slightly on his glass. "You'll be away more often then?" he asked lightly. "Probably," Sarah said. "At least a few weeks at a time." She said it without hesitation, as though the thought of leaving again didn't bother her. And maybe it didn't. She'd always been like that, moving forward, chasing something just out of reach. Elaine smiled, but her chest ached. She saw in her daughter the same restless hunger that had once pulled her own marriage apart. Later, when Sarah went upstairs to unpack, the house fell quiet again. Mark gathered the dishes, helping Elaine without being asked. Their hands brushed as they worked. The same old accident, the same too long pause afterward. She stepped back quickly, whispering, "Careful." He looked at her, eyes dark with something held in check. "I'm trying to be." The clink of porcelain was the only sound between them after that. The next day the weather turned warm. Sarah spent most of it on calls for work, pacing the garden with her phone pressed to her ear. Elaine watched from the kitchen window as Mark lingered nearby, pretending to be trimming branches that didn't need trimming. At one point, Sarah turned and laughed at something, waving a hand, and for a moment they looked like the perfect young couple they were supposed to be. Elaine forced herself to look away. But that evening, when Sarah announced she'd be leaving again in 2 days for another business trip, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. "That soon?" Mark asked. She nodded. "It's just a short one. You'll survive a week without me." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course." Elaine didn't trust herself to speak. That night, Elaine went to bed early, though sleep refused to come. Downstairs she could hear their voices, low, affectionate, then fading into quiet. She tried not to imagine them close, tried not to let her thoughts betray her. But somewhere around midnight, she heard the faint creak of the stairs. A soft knock on her door followed. She froze. For a moment she didn't move, barely breathing. Then she rose, heart pounding, and opened the door. It was Mark, his face caught between guilt and urgency. Sorry," he whispered. "I couldn't sleep." She stepped aside before she could think better of it. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said. "But I had to see you." Her hands trembled slightly. "This isn't fair to anyone." "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. I need to understand what this is. Between us." She looked at him, at the quiet desperation in his eyes. "It's nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It has to be nothing." He nodded but didn't move. His silence said everything words couldn't. They stood there in the dim light, inches apart, both caught in that unbearable space between confession and restraint. And then, with visible effort, he turned away. "Good night, Elaine," he said softly. When he was gone, she sat on the edge of the bed, shaking. She had never wanted something she knew she couldn't have this much before. The next morning, Sarah left for the airport. The house felt hollow again. Mark stayed behind under the pretext of finishing some work in town. Elaine didn't ask questions. They moved around each other like two people avoiding a flame. Every conversation was careful, every glance too heavy. Lunch, Mark finally spoke. "Do you ever think life gives people second chances? Even at the wrong time?" Elaine set down her cup. "Second chances at what?" He hesitated. "At feeling alive again." She smiled sadly. "Maybe. But sometimes those chances come disguised as mistakes." He looked at her and for once didn't argue. That evening, the air grew thick and still, the sky tinted with amber light. They sat on the porch again, the same porch, the same quiet. Elaine tried to talk about ordinary things. The garden, the weather, the new book she was reading. But each word felt thin, fragile, unable to cover the silence that waited beneath. Finally, Mark said, "Do you ever wish you'd done things differently?" She didn't answer right away. "Yes," she said at last. "But wishing doesn't change the past. It only makes the present harder." He nodded, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the trees. "I keep thinking about what we almost said that night. about how it felt like the world stopped for a second. "Don't," she whispered. "Please." He turned to her, voice low. "I'm trying. But every time I look at you, Mark." He stopped. The sound of his name from her lips was enough to silence him. They sat there, suspended in a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. Not a touch, not a word more, but everything unsaid burning quietly between them. When the first stars appeared, Elaine stood. "I think you should go home," she said softly. He rose too, his eyes full of something raw and tender. "Will you be all right?" She smiled faintly. "I've been all right for a long time." He nodded, but neither believed it. After he left, Elaine stayed outside a while longer. The night was still, the air warm against her skin. She thought about Sarah, about love that was young and bright, about how easily it could fade. She thought about Mark, about the loneliness she saw in him, the reflection of her own. And she thought about herself, a woman who had spent years pretending she no longer needed the very thing that made her human. Maybe this was her punishment, to feel alive again, just when it was too late. She closed her eyes and for the first time let herself cry, not out of guilt, but because she knew the story wasn't over yet. Autumn came quietly that year. The mornings grew cool, the light sharper, and the trees that lined the drive turned shades of gold and rust. Elaine loved this time of year, always had, though now even beauty carried a shadow. Sarah had returned home again, this time for good, or so she said. Her promotion meant she could work remotely. She was radiant, confident, full of purpose. Elaine was proud of her, fiercely so. And yet, watching her daughter move through the house, laughing, calling for Mark, brushing past him in moments of quick affection, Elaine felt the faintest tremor beneath it all, like the echo of a note struck once and still vibrating somewhere deep in the walls. Mark was quieter now. He smiled when spoken to, helped with small repairs, asked polite questions. On the surface, everything was normal again. But beneath that calm, something unspoken lived on, fragile and alive, like an ember refusing to die. One afternoon, while Sarah worked in the garden, Elaine found Mark in the shed, sorting through tools. The door stood half open, sunlight slanting in through the dust. He didn't notice her at first. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his hands steady, deliberate, but his expression far away. When he looked up and saw her, something flickered across his face. Surprise, and then that quiet ache she'd tried for weeks to forget. "I didn't mean to startle you," she said. He smiled faintly. "You never do." She hesitated in the doorway. "You've been distant lately." "I thought that's what you wanted," he said simply. "It is," she replied, though the word didn't sound true even to her. He set down the wrench in his hand, wiped his palms on a cloth, and leaned back against the workbench. "Sarah's happy," he said. "She is. That should make me happy too." Elaine said nothing. He looked down, voice quieter now. "But sometimes I catch myself wishing I'd met you first." The world seemed to stop for a moment. "Don't," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw not desire, not even longing, but something far more painful, understanding. "I know," he said. "It doesn't change anything. I just needed you to know." Elaine's breath trembled. "And now that I do." He gave a sad, almost grateful smile. "Now I can stop pretending it never existed." That night, the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of rain and fallen leaves. Elaine stood at her bedroom window, watching the storm clouds gather. Down the hall, she could hear the low murmur of Sarah and Mark's voices. Soft, affectionate, domestic. It should have comforted her. Instead, it hollowed her out. She turned from the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. A woman who had spent her life keeping things in order, only to find herself undone by what she could never allow. When she finally slept, she dreamed of a summer years ago, of laughter, sunlight, and a kind of love that had once seemed endless. She woke with tears on her cheeks. The next morning, Sarah suggested they all take a drive to the coast. "It'll be good for us," she said brightly. "We haven't done anything together in ages." Elaine agreed, though the idea filled her with unease. The road wound through the hills, the air cool and salt-touched. They stopped at a small cafe by the sea, the kind with whitewashed walls and windows fogged by steam. Over lunch, Sarah teased Mark about his habit of overpacking for trips. He laughed, his eyes lighting up in that easy way she'd always loved. Elaine watched them, a strange warmth and sorrow mingling in her chest. This was how it should be, she told herself. This was right. When Sarah stepped away to take a call, Mark turned slightly toward Elaine. "She's happy," he said again, almost as if reminding himself. "Yes," Elaine said softly. "Hold on to that." He nodded. "And you?" "I have what I need," she said. "Peace, garden, and the memory of something beautiful I was never meant to keep." He looked at her then, his eyes glistening with a tenderness that would never be spoken aloud. "You deserve more than peace." She smiled faintly. "No, peace is enough." They drove back as the sky began to dim. Sarah fell asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting on Mark's shoulder. Elaine sat in the back, watching the road unwind before them, feeling the slow ache of acceptance settle in her bones. At one point, Mark caught her reflection in the mirror. Their eyes met for just a second, long enough to say goodbye without words. Winter followed soon after. Snow covered the fields, the house stood wrapped in quiet, and life slipped into its steady rhythm again. Mark and Sarah moved closer to the city, visiting on weekends. Elaine filled her days with books, with small joys, the scent of bread baking, the company of the wind through bare branches. Sometimes she'd find one of his old tools in the shed, or a shirt he'd forgotten folded neatly in a drawer. She never threw them away. She told herself it was habit, not sentiment. But deep down she knew better. One evening months later she received a letter. It was from Mark. Just a short note. "Dear Elaine, I've thought about writing this 100 times and never knew what to say. Maybe I still don't. But I wanted you to know that I've kept my promise. To Sarah, to myself, to you. I'm happy. Truly. But some part of me will always carry that week. Not as regret, but as something that reminded me how alive a soul can feel, even when it must stay silent. Thank you for that." Elaine folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with old photographs and postcards, things that belonged to another version of herself. Then she went out to the garden. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the first hints of green beneath. She knelt, pressing her hand to the damp earth. The world was waking again. And though her heart ached with everything unsaid, there was also a quiet gratitude, for the storm that had passed, for the light that remained, and for the strange, impossible tenderness that had once touched her life and let her feel, for a moment, that she still could love. Elaine smiled faintly, her breath visible in the cold air. It was enough.